Welcome to the 2 a.m. Theory Podcast. This is where late night thoughts turn into late night conversation.
I want you to think about something for a second. Just stop whatever you're doing right now and really genuinely ask yourself a question. How different would your life be right now if you had made just one tiny, small decision differently a week ago?
Yeah, or a year ago.
Exactly. What about 10 years ago? Like if you had just hit snooze one more time on a random Tuesday, or if you had decided to walk down a different street to get coffee, or I don't know, if you hadn't sent that one text message.
It is a dizzying thought experiment, honestly.
Right. It is the exact kind of thought that usually hits you at 2 a.m. when you're just staring at the ceiling trying to untangle the threads of how you ended up exactly where you are in your life.
And the scary part is, once you start pulling at that single thread, the entire fabric of your current reality just starts to unravel.
Cool.
You realize that literally everything you know, everyone you love, your whole existence is just balancing on the edge of countless, seemingly insignificant moments that had to happen exactly the way they did.
That 2 a.m. feeling, that sense of overwhelming fragility, that is the exact atmosphere we are stepping into for this deep dive today.
Hey.
We're walking right into the wild, unpredictable storm of the butterfly effect and chaos theory.
Which is such a fascinating rabbit hole.
It really is. We are going to investigate how these microscopic changes, these tiny variables, they don't just alter our personal lives. They have literally diverted the entire course of human history.
And we have a massive stack of material guiding us through the dark today to figure this out.
We really do. What are we looking at?
Well, we are pulling from foundational texts of history, like Barbara Tuchman's incredibly detailed account of the outbreak of World War I, and we've got Michael Dobbs's minute-by-minute reconstruction of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Some really heavy historical hitters.
Yeah, exactly. But we're also looking at the science. We've got James Gleick's defining work on chaos theory and Daniel Kahneman's research into the biological flaws of human decision-making.
And to tie it all together, we are anchoring all of this with the ancient philosophy of Marcus Aurelius.
Right. Because the goal today isn't just to look at scientific anomalies or fun historical coincidences.
No. The mission today is to strip away the comfortable illusions we have about control. We're using these sources to ask some of the heaviest questions human beings can ask about fate, about free will,
and about whether this universe we live in is a predictable machine that we can eventually master, or if it is just a wild, untamable storm.
I mean, to really understand the sheer panic that chaos theory caused in the scientific community, we kind of have to look at what science was absolutely certain of before the 1960s, right?
Oh, absolutely. For centuries, the smartest people on Earth thought they had the universe completely figured out, like solved.
They operated under a worldview that we call the clockwork universe.
Yeah, if we go back to the late 1600s, you have Isaac Newton. He developed his laws of motion, and they were brilliant, elegant, and they basically showed that physical objects followed strict mathematical rules.
It all made sense.
Right. Planets orbiting the sun, the trajectory of a cannonball, apples falling from trees. It all made perfect mathematical sense.
There was literally an equation for everything. The universe wasn't some mystical, unpredictable realm to them anymore. It was an engine.
Exactly. And if you understand the gears of an engine, you can calculate exactly what it's going to do next.
This confidence reached its absolute peak, from what I read, with a French mathematician named Pierre-Simon Laplace in 1814.
Oh, yes. Laplace is the ultimate example of this mindset. He took Newton's laws and just pushed them to their absolute philosophical limit.
He proposed a thought experiment, right? The one that became known as Laplace's demon.
Yeah, Laplace's demon. So Laplace imagined a hypothetical superintelligence. He argued that if this intellect, this demon, knew the exact position and the exact momentum of every single atom in the universe at one specific moment.
Every single atom.
Every single one. And if it had enough computational power to run the numbers, it could perfectly predict the entire future of the cosmos.
So, to Laplace's demon, the future would be just as clear as the past. It is kind of like a cosmic game of pool.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like if you know the exact angle of the cue stick, the force of the strike, the friction of the felt on the table, and the weight of the balls, you know exactly where every ball is going to end up before you even take the shot.
Right, and for nearly 200 years, this was the foundational bedrock of all science. The belief that the universe is a deterministic machine, and our only obstacle to perfect prediction is just a lack of data.
If we just get enough data, we can predict everything.
Exactly. Which brings us to the moment that bedrock cracked completely.
1961.
1961. We have Edward Lorenz, a meteorologist at MIT, and he was running weather simulations.
And he wasn't trying to upend physics, right? He was just doing his job.
He was literally just trying to build a better weather forecast.
Yeah.
He was using this rudimentary computer called the Royal McBee LGP30.
I looked this up. It was the size of a massive desk and incredibly slow by today's standards.
Oh, glacially slow.
Yeah.
And it computed variables like temperature, air pressure, and wind speed using a set of differential equations.
Let's break down how this specific computer program worked, because the actual mechanics of what he was doing are the whole key to the discovery.
Good point. So Lorenz's simulation was continuous. The computer would take the initial weather data, run it through the equations to predict the weather for the next day, and then take that new output and feed it back into the equations as the input for the following day.
So it's a recursive loop.
Exactly, a loop. And one day, Lorenz wanted to re-examine a specific sequence of data from the middle of a simulation he had run earlier.
And instead of starting the whole program over from the beginning, which would take forever on that machine, he decided to save some time.
Right. He looked at the paper printout from the previous run, found a midpoint, and typed those numbers back into the machine to start the simulation from there.
Now here is where the magic happens. The machine's internal memory had been calculating these variables out to 6 decimal places.
Very precise.
Right, so one of the numbers in the sequence for, let's say, air pressure was 0.56127. But the paper printout Lorenz was reading from, it only displayed 3 decimal places to save space on the page.
Ah!
So he just typed in 0.506. He lopped off the 0.0000127.
That is a difference of about 1/10,000th. It is a microscopic rounding error.
Microscopic.
And according to the plus, and according to 2 centuries of established science, if the starting conditions are 99.999% identical, the outcome should be 99.999% identical.
It just makes logical sense. So Lorenz goes to grab a cup of coffee, fully expecting the new simulation to effectively duplicate the previous run.
Right, why wouldn't it? But when he comes back, he looks at the new printout, and the numbers have completely diverged.
Like complete.
Completely. The simulated weather pattern hasn't just shifted slightly, it has evolved into something entirely unrecognizable.
Because of the recursive nature of those equations, that missing fraction of a fraction didn't just sit there.
No, it compounded. The error doubled, then quadrupled, spiraling out of control until the entire global weather system was drastically altered.
Just from that tiny little fraction.
Exactly. Lorenz proved that in complex, nonlinear systems, a tiny discrepancy doesn't just mean your prediction is slightly wrong, it means your prediction is eventually rendered completely useless.
Wow.
And this accidental discovery birthed the formal scientific concept known as sensitive dependence on initial conditions.
Sensitive dependence on initial conditions. That phrase is really the beating heart of chaos theory. It means that tiny causes can create massive systemic effects.
Right.
Now, I want to clarify something about chaos theory for everyone listening. Based on James Gleick's book, Chaos, Making a New Science, chaos does not mean random.
That is a very important distinction.
Yeah. These systems, like the weather or ocean currents or the stock market, they are entirely deterministic. They follow strict rules.
Yes, they do.
But they are so incredibly sensitive to their starting parameters that they remain fundamentally impossible to predict over the long term.
And to visualize this, Lorenz mapped his equations onto a 3-dimensional graph. He plotted 3 variables, the rate of convection, horizontal temperature variation, and vertical temperature variation.
And what did that look like?
Well, what emerged on the graph wasn't a straight line. And it wasn't a mess of random dots either. The line spiraled around a central point, then flipped over and spiraled around another point, looping back and forth forever without ever intersecting itself.
And the shape it created in this phase space famously looked exactly like the 2 wings of a butterfly.
Exactly. This mathematical model became known as the Lorenz attractor.
And the shape was remarkably fitting because in 1972, Lorenz gave a presentation to the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Do you remember the title of his speech?
I do. The title was Predictability. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas?
It's iconic. He was using the butterfly as a metaphor for those microscopic, immeasurable variables, the tiny disturbances that get caught in the recursive loop of the atmosphere and compound into massive storms.
But let me push back on this idea of impossibility for a second, because anyone listening to this right now is probably looking at the phone in their pocket, which has Way more computing power than the entire MIT campus did in 1961.
That's very true.
So if chaos theory admits that these systems do actually follow rules, why can't our modern supercomputers eventually crack the code? Like, if we throw enough quantum computing power at the weather, shouldn't we be able to predict it perfectly?
It is a logical question, but the barrier isn't computing power. The barrier is measurement.
Measurement.
Yeah. To predict a chaotic system perfectly, you need to know the initial conditions perfectly. Not to 6 decimal places, not to 1 billion decimal places, but infinitely.
Oh, wow.
You would need to measure the exact temperature, pressure, and velocity of every single molecule of air on the entire planet simultaneously.
And infinite precision is physically impossible.
Exactly. You can't measure the entire universe without stepping outside of it.
Which means Laplace's demon is dead.
Very dead. The realization that some systems, by their very fundamental mathematical nature, will forever escape our ability to predict them was a profound philosophical shock to the scientific community.
And honestly, it's a shock to think about in our own lives. Because, if a fraction of a degree breaks a global weather forecast, what does a fraction of a decision do to human history?
Oh, it completely rewrites it.
Right. If weather is a chaotic system, human society, with billions of interacting people making choices every second, is infinitely more sensitive to initial conditions.
Without a doubt.
So let's apply this mathematical concept to something incredibly tangible from our sources. Let's look at the events that triggered World War I, specifically the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914.
The logistics of that specific day in Sarajevo, they literally read like a textbook study of the butterfly effect.
Walk us through it, because it wasn't just one straightforward assassination.
Right. No, not at all. There was actually a planned assassination attempt earlier in the day that completely failed. A conspirator threw a bomb at the Archduke's open-topped car as it was driving down the street.
Okay.
But the bomb bounced off the folded back roof of the car and exploded under the vehicle behind them instead. The Archduke survived perfectly fine and went on to the town hall.
So the initial plan fails.
Right. But later that afternoon, the Archduke decides he wants to visit the people who were injured by the bomb in the hospital.
Which seems like a nice logical thing for a leader to do.
Sure. And the officials decide to change the route to the hospital to avoid the crowded city center for safety reasons.
Okay, that makes sense.
But, and here is the massive variable, no one tells the Archduke's driver about the route change.
You have got to be kidding me. No one tells the driver.
No one tells the driver. So the driver follows the original route. He makes a right turn onto a street called Franz Joseph Street. The governor, who is sitting in the car with the Archduke, realizes the mistake and yells at the driver to stop and turn around.
Here is the microscopic variable, the flapping wing of the butterfly.
Yeah.
The car doesn't have a modern reverse gear.
Right. It's 1914.
So the driver stops, but to turn around, he has to slowly stall the engine and essentially push the car backward. The car is effectively immobilized in the middle of the street for a few seconds.
And it happens to stall directly in front of a cafe.
A random cafe.
A random cafe. And standing outside that specific cafe at that exact moment is Gavrilo Princip.
The assassin.
He was one of the original assassins from the morning's failed plot. He'd actually given up, thinking the opportunity was completely gone, and went to get a sandwich.
Oh my God.
Princip looks up, and the target he thought he had missed is practically idling right in front of him.
Wow.
He steps forward, fires 2 shots, and fractures history.
That one wrong turn by a lost driver directly leads to the deaths of 20 million people in World War I.
It is staggering.
And World War I sets the stage for World War II, which leads to the Cold War. It basically reshapes the entire modern world. The 20th century, as we know it, was born from a steering wheel turning the wrong way.
And that catastrophic cascading effect is the entire focus of Barbara W. Tuchman's Pulitzer-winning history, The Guns of August.
That book is incredible.
It is, because Tuchman doesn't just chronicle the assassination itself. She dissects the chaotic system that the assassination triggered. She focuses on the opening month of the war, tracing how the massive, complex European empires essentially trapped themselves in their own machinery.
Right. We really have to understand the logistics of 1914 warfare to understand why it couldn't just be stopped once it started. The military doctrines of the time were entirely reliant on rigid railway timetables.
Yeah, the trains are the key here. Germany's strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, required a massive, immediate sweep through Belgium to knock out France before Russia could fully mobilize in the east.
And to execute this, the German military had to coordinate something like over 11,000 trains.
Over 11,000. And the schedules were calculated down to the minute to ensure troops, artillery, and supplies all arrived simultaneously without causing a massive traffic jam.
Because these were mostly single-track railway networks,
Yeah.
right? You couldn't just pull a train filled with 10,000 soldiers over the side of the road if diplomacy suddenly started making progress.
Exactly. If you stopped one train at the border, the train behind it would crash, or they would all bottleneck, utterly destroying the entire nation's defensive logistics.
Tuchman points out that the leaders of Europe, the czars, the kaisers, the diplomats, they believed they had absolute control over this.
They really did. They thought they were operating a Laplacian machine. They assumed they could initiate mobilization as a diplomatic threat, kind of flex their muscles, and then just halt it at the last minute if the enemy backed down.
But the machinery of war was just too complex. Once the gears started turning, the system took over. The irony of their meticulous planning is that it actually became the engine of their destruction.
They thought they were the mechanics, but they were really just cogs caught in a recursive loop of escalation.
It is the ultimate historical illustration of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. The political assumptions, the delayed telegrams, the rigid train schedules, they all acted as multipliers for chaos.
Yeah, there is this moment where the Tsar of Russia tried to cancel a partial mobilization order, but his generals told him the railway algorithms literally couldn't be altered without leaving Russia totally defenseless for months. The system had totally eclipsed the men running it.
Okay, wait, hold on. I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because Europe was a total powder keg in 1914. You had a massive arms race, tangled secret alliances, rampant nationalism everywhere. Are you seriously arguing that if the driver had a GPS or if the car had installed on Franz Joseph Street, World War I just wouldn't have happened at all? That seems like a stretch to me. The pressure was going to blow eventually.
You're touching on the classic historical debate there. And yes, the dry powder was everywhere. Most historians, including Tuchman, agree that an explosion of some kind was highly probable.
Right.
If not in Sarajevo, it might have been a naval incident in the Mediterranean or maybe a border skirmish a year later. The tornado was definitely forming.
Okay, so then the driver's mistake didn't cause the war.
Well, chaos theory demands we look at the shape of the tornado.
The shape.
Yes. The specific alliances that were triggered in that exact moment, the timing of the Russian mobilization, the exact political leaders who were in power in August 1914, even the weather conditions during those opening offensives, all of that dictated the horrific, static meat grinder of trench warfare that we got.
I see.
A war delayed by even 6 months might have unfolded with entirely different strategies, maybe a different entry point for Britain and a completely different post-war map. So the explosion might have been inevitable, but the specific catastrophic reality of August 1914, the reality that birthed our modern world, was entirely dependent on those initial conditions in Sarajevo.
That realization is honestly terrifying. The idea that the grand narrative of human history isn't guided by some overarching destiny, but is highly sensitive to traffic errors and train algorithms.
It is terrifying. And the really scary part is that the terrifying lessons of 1914 weren't just academic history. They became a visceral reality for the next generation of leaders.
We see this directly in the sources. If we fast forward to October 1962, the world is facing a threat that basically dwarfs 1914. The Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. And President John F. Kennedy had actually recently read The Guns of August.
Oh, wow, the timing on that.
Yeah. He was profoundly influenced by Tuchman's depiction of how leaders in 1914 stumbled blindly into a war none of them actually wanted, simply because they lost control of their own military systems.
Kennedy saw the railway timetables of World War I and basically recognized them in the nuclear protocols of the Cold War.
Exactly. He realized that if he wasn't incredibly careful, the machinery of nuclear escalation would take over, and they would be pushed into an exchange by their own automated protocols.
And that intense awareness of systemic fragility is central to Michael Dobbs's book, 1 Minute to Midnight.
Yes, Dobbs utilizes decades of newly declassified archives to reconstruct the 13 days of the crisis. And he does something really interesting. He shifts the focus away from the boardroom chess match between Kennedy and Khrushchev and instead focuses on the chaos happening on the periphery.
Dobbs proves that it wasn't the men at the top making rational decisions that almost ended the world. It was the near misses, the accidents, the butterflies flapping their wings in the dark.
Right. Like, for instance, right at the peak of the tension on October 27th, an American U-2 spy plane accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula in the Arctic.
I have to ask, How does a highly trained pilot accidentally fly a spy plane into the Soviet Union during literally the most tense standoff in human history?
It's crazy, but it was a navigational error driven by environmental variables.
More variables.
Always. The pilot, Chuck Maltzby, was navigating by the stars, but the aurora borealis actually blinded his view of the sky. And compasses are highly unreliable near the North Pole anyway.
So he just got lost.
He got lost, just like the driver in Sarajevo.
Wow. And the moment he crosses into Soviet airspace, Soviet MiG fighter jets immediately scramble to intercept and destroy him.
Naturally.
And in response to that, American F-102 fighters scramble from Alaska to protect him. And the absolutely terrifying detail here is that because the U.S. defense readiness was at DEFCON 2, those American fighters were armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles.
Yep. And the pilots had the authority to fire them.
That is insane.
Khrushchev later wrote to Kennedy about this incident, and he was deeply alarmed. He asked if this stray plane was a deliberate provocation to start the war. A completely unintended navigational error almost triggered a nuclear exchange right there.
Dobbs also reveals that U.S. intelligence had completely miscalculated the initial conditions on the ground in Cuba.
They really did.
They didn't know the Soviets already had nearly 100 tactical nuclear weapons actually on the island. And worse, the local Soviet commanders had pre-delegated authority to use them if the Americans invaded.
So the assumption of control in Washington was just an illusion.
A complete illusion.
Yeah.
But out of all the terrifying details in the archives Dobbs went through, there is one story that stands out as the ultimate butterfly effect. The story of Vasily Arkhipov.
Arkhipov was a Soviet naval officer. He was the second in command aboard the B-59.
And what was the B-59?
It was a diesel-powered submarine operating in the waters of the Sargasso Sea near Cuba.
Let's detail the environment inside that submarine, because the physical conditions completely dictated the psychology of the crew.
Definitely. The B-59 was designed for the freezing waters of the Arctic, not the warm waters of the Caribbean, and the air conditioning had completely failed.
Oh, man.
The internal temperature was sweltering. It was reaching well over 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the engine compartments.
That is brutal.
The crew was exhausted, severely dehydrated, and suffering from acute carbon dioxide buildup because they couldn't surface to ventilate the boat.
Right, and most critically, because they were running so deep to evade American sonar, they had been cut off from communication with Moscow for days.
They are completely in the dark. They have no idea what's happening. They don't know if a diplomatic solution is being reached or if Washington and Moscow have already been reduced to ash.
And above them, a fleet of U.S. Navy destroyers begins dropping practice depth charges.
Yeah. The Americans are using these as signaling grenades, basically trying to force the submarine to surface and identify itself.
But to the terrified, suffocating Soviet crew trapped inside a metal tube at the bottom of the ocean, these massive underwater explosions sound like lethal, hull-breaching attacks.
You can imagine the panic. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, is convinced World War III has already started. He assumes the surface world is already fighting.
And the B-59 is armed with a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo.
Yes. The blast would have been comparable to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima.
Savitsky orders the nuclear torpedo to be armed and readied for launch against the American aircraft carrier above them.
And just to be clear, firing that weapon would have resulted in an immediate, full-scale nuclear retaliation from the United States. It would have triggered the end of human civilization.
Now, the protocol on this specific submarine required 3 senior officers to unanimously agree to launch the nuclear weapon. The captain, Savitsky, says yes. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agrees.
And Vasily Arkhipov, he says no.
He just says no.
He outright refuses. Despite the heat, the exhaustion, the explosions rocking the hull, and the absolute fury of his commanding officer, Arkhipov maintains his composure.
Incredible.
He argues that they do not know the actual situation on the surface, that the depth charges are too small to be lethal attacks and must just be signals. He uses his authority to single-handedly veto the launch. He talks the captain down, and they eventually surface peacefully.
I just want that reality to wash over you, the listener, for a second. You, your parents, your friends, you only exist today because one guy sweating in a suffocating tin can at the bottom of the ocean decided to keep a cool head and argue with his boss.
It is the starkest reminder that grand outcomes are incredibly sensitive to initial conditions.
Human history wasn't saved by philosopher kings in boardrooms making brilliant strategic moves. It was saved by a localized argument in the dark.
Exactly. And we see this on the opposite end of the spectrum as well. The sources briefly touch upon Apollo 11 to show that humanity's greatest triumphs are just as dependent on microscopic variables.
Yeah, Apollo 11 is the perfect counterweight to the submarine story. We think of the moon landing as this flawless triumph of Laplacian engineering.
But when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were descending to the lunar surface in the Eagle lander, the system almost collapsed.
What happened?
The onboard computer started throwing a 1202 program alarm. It was an overload error.
The rendezvous radar, which they didn't even need for the landing, was feeding a massive stream of extraneous data into the computer. It was a microscopic variable, literally a switch left in the wrong position, that threatened the entire mission.
Right. The computer was being asked to process more equations than it physically could handle.
But the system was saved by another microscopic variable, the architecture of the software designed by Margaret Hamilton.
Yeah, her software was asynchronous. It was designed to prioritize tasks. So when it got overloaded, it dropped the low-priority radar data and focused entirely on keeping the engine firing and the lander stable.
And even then, because of the delay, the computer was guiding them into a boulder field. Armstrong had to take manual control, flying the lander like a helicopter, and touch down with mere seconds of fuel remaining.
Our near destruction in Cuba and our greatest achievement on the moon both balanced on incredibly small, razor-thin fulcrums.
Which raises a really interesting psychological question. Why do we always assume the generals in Washington or the directors at NASA are in absolute control of these situations? Why is it deeply unsettling for us to realize that wrong turns, software algorithms, and isolated submarine arguments are the true architects of our existence?
Because our brains are biologically wired to reject chaos, we physically cannot handle the idea that the universe is unpredictable.
And to understand why that is, our sources turn to Daniel Kahneman's masterpiece of behavioral economics, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Kahneman spent his entire career mapping the architecture of human decision-making. And the core of his theory rests on the idea that our minds operate using two distinct systems, which he simply labels System 1 and System 2.
Let's break down the evolutionary biology of these two systems because it explains everything about how we view history and our own lives.
Okay, so System 1 is fast. It is intuitive, emotional, automatic, and entirely subconscious. It evolved to keep us alive in dangerous prehistoric environments by instantly recognizing patterns and reacting to them without hesitation.
So if you are walking through the jungle and you see the bushes rustling, System 1 instantly screams, "That's a tiger, run."
Exactly. It doesn't want to stop and analyze the wind speed or the trajectory of the leaves. It prioritizes survival over absolute accuracy. It is basically a meaning-making, pattern-recognizing machine.
Right. And System 2, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. It is slow, deliberate, analytical, and logical.
It is the part of your brain you use when you are solving a complex differential equation or, parallel parking in a tight space. And critically, System 2 requires immense effort. It literally burns calories to use.
And the fundamental problem Kahneman points out is that humans are just biologically lazy. Because System 2 is so metabolically exhausting, we rely on System 1 way more than we actually should.
We really do. System 1 abhors a vacuum. It demands cause and effect. It cannot process the concept of random, meaningless chaos. So when faced with the massive, chaotic variables of the universe, System 1 invents meaning. It forces us to create narratives out of coincidence.
Kahneman highlights a phenomenon called hindsight bias.
Oh, this is a big one.
When we look back at history, our System 1 kicks in and cleans up the mess. We look at the outbreak of World War I, and instead of seeing the terrifying reality of a stalled car and a lost driver, our brains construct a smooth, logical narrative.
We say imperialism led to an arms race, which inevitably led to war.
We smooth out the jagged edges. We ignore the near misses of the Cuban Missile Crisis and tell ourselves that rational deterrence prevailed.
We assume that because something happened, it had to happen exactly that way. Hindsight bias gives us the illusion that the past was predictable.
And that illusion falsely gives us the comfort that the future is controllable.
Which is such a trap.
This sounds exactly like Plato's cave.
It really does.
We're all basically chained up watching the shadow play of System 1 narratives, completely ignoring the chaotic reality that is actually casting the shadows.
That is the perfect philosophical bridge right there. In Plato's The Republic, the allegory of the cave describes prisoners who have spent their entire lives facing a blank cave wall, watching shadows cast by a fire behind them.
They study the shadows, they name them, and they build their entire understanding of reality based on these illusions.
Kahneman is essentially saying that our hindsight biases, our neat historical timelines, our belief that we are the masters of our own destinies, those are literally the shadows on the wall.
Yes.
The true, chaotic reality of the universe, the infinite variables, the sensitive dependence on initial conditions, the compounding rounding errors of Edward Lorenz, that reality exists completely outside the cave.
It is glaring, complex, and impossible for System 1 to comprehend.
When we try to look directly at the chaos, it's like a prisoner stepping out of the cave into the blazing sun. It is painful and profoundly disorienting.
System 1 is basically a conspiracy theorist standing in front of a corkboard with a spool of red string.
I love that analogy.
It's just aggressively pinning random dots of chaos together, creating connections that don't exist, simply because the alternative is too terrifying.
The alternative is accepting that life is a series of entirely random butterfly wings. And that is just too exhausting for System 2 to process.
So we just retreat back into the comfort of the cave. We tell ourselves comfortable stories like, I got this job because I'm talented and my resume was perfect, rather than, I got this job because my train was delayed and I happened to bump into the hiring manager while waiting for a coffee.
We want to believe we earned it, not that we just got lucky.
Which brings us to the ultimate 2 a.m. question of the night. If our brains are constantly tricking us into seeing order, and our lives are actually at the mercy of chaotic, microscopic variables cascading through recursive loops, how do we cope with that reality without just losing our minds?
That is the big question.
If everything is so fragile, how do we stand firm?
To answer that, our sources turn to one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, a man who lived his entire life surrounded by literal, violent chaos, but found a way to build an impenetrable fortress inside his own mind.
We are talking about Marcus Aurelius and his private journal, Meditations. Let's set the physical scene here because the contrast is just incredible. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome in the 2nd century CE. He was arguably the most powerful man on earth.
But he wasn't writing Meditations from some comfortable, safe palace in Rome?
No, he wrote it in the mud and the blood of the northern frontiers along the Danube River in the 170 CE.
He was dealing with a chaotic system that was actively collapsing all around him.
He faced relentless invasions from Germanic tribes, internal political betrayals from his closest generals, and the Antonine Plague, which was a devastating pandemic that was decimating the Roman population.
He was quite literally standing in the middle of a tornado. The empire was spiraling completely out of control.
And Meditations was his method of survival. It wasn't written for an audience, right? It was his private attempt to apply Stoic philosophy to his own mind in real time.
And the central foundational pillar of Stoicism is the strict dichotomy of control.
Aurelius recognized that he could not control the microscopic variables. He could not control the plague. He could not completely control the actions of his enemies or the loyalty of his troops.
He was a piece of driftwood caught in the compounding equations of fate.
So if you cannot control the butterfly, what do you actually do?
You control your reaction to the tornado? Stoicism teaches the active acceptance of fate. It is not passive resignation. It is a clear-eyed acknowledgement of mathematical reality.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. Aurelius trained himself to sever his emotional attachment to unpredictable outcomes.
He focused entirely on his own reason, his own virtue, and his own immediate actions.
He essentially concluded the chaotic system of the universe is going to produce whatever output it produces. My only job is to be a rational, virtuous person in the exact microsecond I am currently inhabiting.
It is the ultimate philosophical antidote to the anxiety of chaos theory. If you obsess over every small decision, if you paralyze yourself wondering what the compounding long-term consequences of a single action will be, you will drive yourself completely mad.
Because you can't know.
You can't. Aurelius realized that you only ever inhabit the present moment. You cannot map the infinite branches of chaos. You can only choose to act with integrity right now.
And that brings the debate right back to you, the listener. Because this tension between chaos and stoicism hits on the oldest argument in human thought. Fate versus free will.
It is the eternal question.
If missing a train or making a random career choice or sending a text message alters your entire timeline, is your future already written by invisible forces?
If a butterfly causes a storm, are we just living out the results of infinite cascading effects?
Are we just dominoes falling in a line? Or are we the hand that pushes them?
It's the question Laplace thought he had solved with his demon, and the question Lorenz proved we can never truly answer.
Which leads me to this late-night time machine dilemma. Based on the philosophical questions in our sources, I really want to pose this directly to you. Think about your biggest regret.
We all have one.
a mistake you made, an opportunity you let slip away, a relationship you ruined. If you had a time machine, and you could go back and change that one specific thing, would you?
It is a profoundly heavy thought experiment.
It really is. Because knowing what we now know about sensitive dependence on initial conditions, if you go back and alter that one painful variable, you aren't just fixing a localized mistake.
No, you are changing the initial parameters of the continuous equation of your entire life.
Which means you risk erasing everything good that came afterward. The friends you met, the lessons you learned, the resilience you built, maybe even the family you have now.
Would you risk erasing the entire architecture of your current reality just to fix a shadow in the past?
The terrifying beauty of a chaotic system is that you cannot untangle the threads. The triumphs are woven from the exact same chaotic fabric as the tragedies.
So true.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring all these threads together for everyone.
Well, we started with the absolute arrogance of Laplace's machine, the belief that the universe was a perfectly predictable engine.
And then we watched Edward Lorenz break that machine by lopping off a single decimal point, proving that microscopic errors compound into massive chaos.
We saw how a stalled car on Franz Joseph Street and the rigid train schedules of the Schlieffen Plan proved the terrifying fragility of human planning in 1914.
We stood in a sweltering submarine with Vasily Arkhipov as he single-handedly halted the end of the world.
We used Daniel Kahneman to understand how our System 1 brains aggressively shield us from this reality by inventing neat little narratives, mistaking the shadows on Plato's cave wall for the actual truth.
And here is the ultimate synthesis of all these ideas. When you look at the infinite mathematics of Lorenz alongside the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, you realize something profound.
Because the universe's variables are infinite and impossible to predict, focusing inward on your present actions isn't just a coping mechanism.
It is the only mathematically sound strategy for survival.
You cannot calculate the butterfly. You can only calculate yourself.
The overarching takeaway from these sources is a radical shift in perspective. You are not just a passenger on a predetermined train track. And history isn't just shaped by grand treaties, brilliant generals, or inevitable destinies. It is shaped by the mundane, the microscopic.
Every person alive right now, including you listening to this, is the mathematical result of millions of tiny, highly improbable events that had to align exactly the way they did.
If your great-grandparents hadn't bumped into each other on a specific street corner because it happened to be raining, you literally wouldn't exist. Sometimes the entire geopolitical timeline of the world shifts simply because someone decided to stop for a cup of coffee.
The universe isn't a clockwork machine. It's a delicate, chaotic, infinitely sensitive masterpiece.
Which makes every single fleeting moment profoundly important.
It really does.
So the next time you're awake at 2 a.m. staring at the ceiling, don't let the weight of the chaos crush you. Let it awe you. Because out of an infinite number of possible timelines, out of an infinite array of compounding errors and microscopic variables, you are here in this one.
It's beautiful, really.